Did you know that there was a time when Mandibuzz was on almost every competitive OU team? Yes, Mandibuzz, this Pokemon. When you think of a meta Pokemon, a high usage Pokemon in OU, this is probably not what you think of. This is a regular vulture from real life. Its stats aren't even very good. What in the world was Mandibuzz doing alongside the heavy hitters like Landorus Therian with its incredible stats and every move on the planet? Or pseudo-legendaries like Garchomp and Dragonite? Surely Mandibuzz is not in the same conversation. Those Pokemon are meta because they have high stats and great typing and great abilities and all of that. But sometimes a Pokemon can be meta for different reasons, for more seemingly random and specific reasons. An unassuming Pokemon like Mandibuzz can have just enough desirable traits to become popular and competitive, despite seeming so much worse than everything else in the format. And funnily enough, in the case of Mandibuzz, this actually happened twice. But first, we must urgently discuss the goings-on of infamous cup-themed Pokemon Cuptonio. Through the sheer power of his signature move, Half Empty, he has now occupied most of the known world. The empire of fear that Iron Mugulus once clung to is slipping away before his eyes, like a shattered mug weakly held together by glue. Only by using YouTube's new hype feature under this video can we hope to resolve this conflict through peaceful negotiation rather than further violence. Liking the video and subscribing to the channel will also help, according to smart people. Thank you. Back in Generation 6, a Pokemon called Aegislash was released, and for a time, Aegislash was the most powerful thing in the entire OU format. This Pokemon was insane, with its incredible Steel Ghost typing, monstrous stats, and its unbelievable ability Stance Change, which allowed it to switch between a massive defensive stat or offensive stat at will. Every time you attack, you gain offensive stats, and when you use the King's Shield move, you revert back to the defensive state. We have never seen a Pokemon like this since, that is able to transform between an offensive and a defensive Pokemon at will. It's an incredibly powerful concept. But the one thing that stood against Aegislash's reign of terror was Mandibuzz. Mandibuzz happens to be a Pokemon that matches up excellently against Aegislash, because Mandibuzz is a dark flying type. So it resists Ghost, and it has access to Dark Stab, dealing extra damage with dark moves. Mandibuzz also has the move Foul Play, and this is a great attack that allows you to deal damage to the enemy based on how high their attack stat is. It's fantastic on defensive Pokemon as counterplay to offensive Pokemon. If you're up against a really strong physical attacker, or if the enemy has boosted up their attack with Swords Dance or Dragon Dance, Foul Play will often just one-hit KO them, punishing them for having high attack. And this move is perfect against Aegislash. If they try to attack you, they will transform into their offensive stance, and because they have such a high attack now, Foul Play will deal super effective massive damage and destroy them in one hit. Mandibuzz was the only thing that could defensively and offensively handle Aegislash, and it was on almost every team as a result. Eventually though, in Gen 6, Aegislash was banned from competitive, deemed too powerful for the metagame, which was fair. And so Mandibuzz flew off into the sunset to return at a later time, to save the metagame when he was needed. And that time did come. In Generation 8, Mandibuzz returned to the forefront for many different reasons, actually. In Gen 8, Aegislash returned to the OU format because it received a stat nerf and was a bit more manageable now. So with Aegislash back in the format, in its new nerfed state, Mandibuzz had a reason to exist again as perhaps the most effective answer to Aegislash in the game. That was one reason to use Aegislash again. Another was the addition of heavy-duty boots to the game, enhancing Mandibuzz defensively, since it could ignore Stealth Rock and switch in much more safely. Gen 8 also saw the significant rise of Ghost type as an offensive powerhouse, because in Gen 8, the move Pursuit was removed from the game entirely. And Pursuit was a move that used to be able to trap and eliminate Ghost types. It kept them in check a little bit. Now that Pursuit was gone, Ghost types could roam freer than they ever have before, and the need for some sort of Ghost resistance was more and more important, as the new Dragapult was in the game, and Gengar was feeling pretty strong too in early metagames. So Mandibuzz had a reason to exist in that sense too. Aegislash was one of the popular ghost threats at the time, as was Dragapult and Gengar. But the usefulness of Mandibuzz did not end there. Later on in DLC, a couple of enormous heavy hitters were introduced to the OU metagame. One of them was Urshifu, a new dark fighting type legendary Pokemon with the absurd new move Wicked Blow. Wicked Blow is a move that always critical hits and has a high AT power. This move was incredibly overwhelming offensively. As Dark is a great offensive type, this has such a high power and ignores defensive boosts. It also ignores Intimidation, because crits ignore attack debuffs. Urshifu was incredibly overwhelming, but guess who the hell resists Wicked Blow and can strike back with a bit of flying type super effective damage? It's our hero Mandibuzz yet again. Now of course Mandibuzz could not switch in against close combat the other attack Urshifu had, but at least it could prevent Choice Band Urshifu from spamming Wicked Blow risk-free. And there was another really broken guy that Mandibuzz also responded well to, and that was Spectria, all new horse Pokemon, and a Pokemon known for being incredibly powerful on the stats side but having a very limited move pool. Spectria pretty much only gets ghost moves. I think it gets Dark Pulse too, and that's it. But its stats are insane, and it has the ability Grim Neigh, which acts like Moxie for special attacks. Even though this Pokemon is so limited in its actual offensive options, those options are so overwhelming that you desperately needed some response to them, and guess who the hell was a great one? Mandibuzz yet again, folks. Mandibuzz, with its dark resistance, ghost resistance, and that ever-valuable foul play. On top of these traits that Mandibuzz has, it was also useful for its access to Defog, to remove hazards, Knock Off as well, to remove items, which is increasingly important, and U-turn to pivot out. These are all great moves. So it's doing this really important defensive job thanks to its typing, and it also just provides your team with really valuable and imperative utility all at once. Not only in that Gen 6 metagame where Aegislash was running rampant, but also in this Gen 8 metagame where Urshifu and Spectria were running rampant. Mandibuzz was everywhere, holding the world on its shoulders, and making this metagame playable single-handedly. Now eventually all of this stuff did get banned in Gen 8. Urshifu was banned, as was Spectria, but surprisingly the usefulness of Mandibuzz still persisted, because Mandibuzz still matched up well against all those ghost types. Aegislash is still occasionally seen, Dragapult is ever present, Blacephalon eventually joined the metagame, and you also match up very well against grassy terrain Rillaboom. That foul play is useful against popular threats like Excadrill and any boost sweeper really, and with boots you are just so much more consistent at switching in. You got that defog and pivoting, which is always great. So Mandibuzz is still pretty good in Gen 8 OU actually. It's not quite OU ranked anymore, with its job not being as imperative as it was in those more tumultuous metagames, but still a respectable position for Mandibuzz, after all was said and done, and I think you can still build with Mandibuzz and do alright with it. The fact that Mandibuzz of all things is a Pokemon that props up whenever metagames are full of broken threats is quite funny to me. It is a Pokemon that I quite like, but it's because of this reason that I like it, that it was randomly meta in these situations. If not for it having these particular traits to rise to the occasion and respond to these broken threats, I don't know if I ever would have thought twice about Mandibuzz. It is just a vulture. It's not a very remarkable Pokemon, but it was elevated to a higher status because of meta conditions, and isn't that beautiful? Isn't that wonderful? I think that's a great story. Pokemon becoming meta, not because of their inherent strength, but because of the environment around them, is one of my favorite phenomenon in competitive Pokemon. And another great example of this is the case of Charizard in Gen 3. This is the only metagame where simple base form Charizard is ranked OU, and it wasn't always the case that Charizard was ranked OU. This is a relatively recent update to the tiering, and Gen 3 is an old Gen tier that does occasionally update the OU list. Even more recently, Medicham rose to OU, but Charizard rising to OU was a big deal, because for years people thought this Pokemon sucked, and when you look at it, just off its fundamental traits you would think that it does suck. It's very weak on the defensive side, its stats are just all around average. 109 special attack is alright, but compared to some of the heavy hitters of OU like Zapdos, Gengar, Tyranitar, Charizard is looking pretty weak comparatively. Charizard also has significant competition from a similar Pokemon. Moltres has the exact same fire-flying type combo and higher stats across the board. Way higher special attack, better bulk, access to Will-O-Wisp, which is very significant. Charizard is seemingly outclassed and just not worth using in this environment. So why did it rise to OU, and why did people realize, wait a second, this guy's actually pretty functional and good in this metagame? Well, first I think we have to acknowledge the fact that Gen 3 is an environment before Stealth Rock existed in the series. Stealth Rock is a move that completely killed Charizard's chances at OU viability ever since it was released, because Stealth Rock is an entry hazard that deals damage as you switch in based on your weakness to rock. And Charizard is of course ×4 weak to rock. This move was everywhere and therefore Charizard was nowhere. But in Gen 3 there's no Stealth Rock to be seen, and in fact the only entry hazard that exists in this game is Spikes, and Charizard is immune to Spikes. Fire Flying is, for most of the Pokemon series, a terrible typing, but in Gen 3 it's a great typing. You have Burn immunity, which is very useful, Spikes immunity, and Ground immunity. Fire types are usually weak to ground and vulnerable to the Pokemon Dugtrio, who can trap you and eliminate you with super effective Earthquake, but Charizard is a fire type that is not worried about such a thing. So that gives Charizard quite a big advantage over other fire types in the game in Gen 3, who are worried about Spikes and Earthquake and Dugtrio, while Charizard isn't. But there's still the issue of competition with Moltres. How does Charizard justify its existence when Moltres is right there? Well, Charizard has two crucial options that Moltres does not have access to. One of them is the move Focus Punch. Focus Punch is a fighting type physical move with 100 accuracy and a massive 150 base power. But there's a catch. When you use this move, you tighten your focus first. And if you are hit with any attack whatsoever, your focus will break and the move will fail. So Focus Punch can only be used if you are predicting that the opponent will not attack or that they will switch out. Otherwise, Focus Punch will do nothing. So Focus Punch is a high risk, high reward move that is hinging on a correct prediction from the user, or the insurance of a substitute being up, because if a substitute is up, it will shield you from the incoming damage and allow Focus Punch to go through unchecked. Charizard having access to this option is significant, because it gives Charizard a way to threaten Blissey. Blissey is the most popular special wall in Gen 3 and one of the most popular Pokemon in high-level competitive play. And Blissey is really excellent against other special attackers like Moltres and Zapdos that are competing with Charizard. Blissey, for the most part, completely stonewalls them and forces them out. Blissey shrugs off all special damage easily, heals up, cripples enemies with status, 1v1s them with Seismic Toss. It's just very difficult to get through Blissey as a special attacker. So Charizard having this option of Focus Punch gives it a way to destroy Blissey where it hurts. Blissey has massive special defense but very low physical defense, and Blissey is weak to fighting. So even though Charizard's attack stat is not very high, only 84 attack, it is enough to threaten Blissey because of the power of Focus Punch and the low defense and weakness to fighting that Blissey suffers from. So for this reason, Charizard is a rare special attacker that is able to threaten the #1 special wall in the game. It also helps that Focus Punch is able to hit Snorlax for significant damage too, another popular special wall with a similar defensive profile to Blissey. And Focus Punch can also punish Tyranitar significantly, because Tyranitar is ×4 weak to fighting and will die to a Focus Punch if you predict that it's coming in. And Tyranitar does like to come in sometimes on Charizard if they're expecting a fire type attack. Charizard can use the Substitute Focus Punch combo to threaten almost the entire game, actually. Fire Blast threatens Skarmory, who is the most popular physical wall. Hidden Power Grass is popular coverage to hit Swampert and other water types like Milotic and Suicune. And then Focus Punch covers Blissey, Snorlax, and Tyranitar. And these are incredibly common Pokemon that you see all the time. The fact that you have this toolset to threaten basically an entire standard Gen 3 OU team elevates Charizard to a level that it wouldn't otherwise. It doesn't have the sheer power of a high special attack stat, but it has these tools that no other special attacker has that happen to threaten the most popular core in the entire game. Another option Charizard has that Moltres does not, that gives it a reason to exist, is Beat Up. And Beat Up is another way to threaten Blissey. Beat Up is a move in Gen 3 that works very weirdly in this generation, but basically what it does is it will do one typeless physical attack for each of your healthy party members. Meaning, for each party member that is still alive and not statused, they will contribute one attack to the Beat Up. And you will attack based on their attack stats. It's kind of weird, but that's how it works. The attacks from Beat Up are typeless, and they also completely ignore all bonus stats. They only attack based on base stats. So Blissey commonly invests fully in defense EVs to make up for its greatest weakness and actually take some physical hits sometimes. But because Beat Up completely ignores EVs and attacks right in the base stat, it will do incredible damage to Blissey. And it also means you don't have to invest in any attack yourself to do good damage to Blissey. So Beat Up is a way to threaten Blissey without needing to make a prediction with Focus Punch or have a substitute up to get the Focus Punch through. Because sometimes Focus Punch is awkward. They can play around it. It requires a prediction to actually go through. But Beat Up just hit Blissey very directly. And the fact that you can tear apart the Blissey means that, well, with Blissey gone, now what the hell switches in on Charizard? Often, nothing does. Now, Beat Up has its own issues too. Like I said, if many of your team members are fainted or statused, they will contribute no attack to the Beat Up, and later game, Beat Up will do like 2 hits sometimes if most of your team's dead or poisoned or whatever. So it's unreliable in that sense. Also, Beat Up does nothing to Snorlax or Tyranitar, while Focus Punch does threaten them. But still, Beat Up is a great option to really punish Blissey users. And for that reason, Charizard does have an actual reason to exist over Moltres, and it has an OU viable position, because this is a Pokemon that seriously punishes the most popular combination of Pokemon in the game. Charizard can single-handedly tear your team apart if you're relying on the common Skarmory, Tyranitar, Blissey, Swampert core, and that is really valuable, it turns out. That is really good. So Charizard is good not because of its fundamental traits, but as a response to the commonplace meta Pokemon and its unique tools to punish them, which I think, once again, is awesome, and I love using Charizard in Gen 3. It's a very satisfying Pokemon to use. Another great example of this phenomenon is the case of Nidoqueen in Generation 4 OU. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Jim, what are you talking about? Nidoqueen is clearly ranked NU in Gen 4. Can't you see that? Well, yes. Gen 4's tiering is frozen in time. So even if something in the current Gen 4 OU metagame is really popular and used all the time, it does not rise to OU, because they just don't do that. Gen 3 does that, and that's why Charizard rose to OU, that's why Medicham recently rose, but Gen 4 does not do that. So you have like Jolteon, who is ranked OU still, and Electivire, even though they are never seen in the current competitive format. And then you have Nidoqueen, who is actually pretty damn popular in current Gen 4 OU, but is frozen in its NU rank, not receiving the proper respect it deserves. And now you might be wondering, well, why the hell would Nidoqueen be any good in Gen 4 OU? Isn't this a high power level environment for the franchise? A significant boost in power from Gen 3, with all sorts of powerful new moves in the game. High stat Pokemon. Look at Nidoqueen, it has pathetic stats. Its highest stat is a measly 90 HP. This Pokemon is nothing. Allow me to explain how Nidoqueen ended up thriving in the competitive Gen 4 OU metagame, despite seeming so hostile. Nidoqueen, first of all, has a really nice defensive typing for this format. Poison Ground is quite good. With Poison typing, you have the benefit of fighting resistance in an environment where close combat is one of the big new flashy moves that is everywhere. Poison typing also grants you an immunity to being poisoned by toxic or other effects, and that always has its value. And poison types, on switch in, automatically remove the new hazard Toxic Spikes. So Nidoqueen just switching onto the field can remove all of an entry hazard, which also has immense value. Ground typing is also incredible, granting electric immunity, immunity to being paralyzed by Thunderwave, and sand immunity. Sand immunity is crucial because permanent sand still exists here, and Tyranitar and that damn hippo are all the rage. They're popular and they're everywhere. So Nidoqueen's typing is great, and it also really helps that you are resistant to rock, meaning Nidoqueen can switch in against Stealth Rock and not mind too much. That is a really big deal. Gen 4 happens to be a metagame that is kind of all about chip damage and annoying chip damage. Sand chip, Stealth Rock chip, Spikes chip. Defensive teams in Gen 4 really abuse chip damage, and Nidoqueen happens to be really good at ignoring much of that chip damage. It removes toxic spikes, which some teams employ to further enhance the chip damage. It's immune to sand, it shrugs off Stealth Rock, it just fits really well. And Nidoqueen happens to match up defensively against some really heavy hitters in the format. One of them being Breloom. Breloom is very popular in Gen 4 with its grass fighting snap combo being really good, of course. Access to Spore giving it significant turn generation and other such stuff. Sometimes it runs sub-focus punch, and of course the move's superpower is very hard hitting too. Nidoqueen, with defensive investment, can come in pretty cleanly against Breloom and shrug it off very well, with fighting resistance and neutrality to grass, as well as the ability to chip heal in the sand. And with Ice Beam, you have a way to threaten the Breloom as well. Nidoqueen matches up similarly well against Infernape, with fighting resistance and a super effective Earthquake coming in handy. And in that instance, the ability Poison Point is also really excellent. Poison Point will punish enemies for making contact with you. There is a 30% chance upon making contact with Nidoqueen that you will get poisoned. It's just level 1 poison, but it's still really punishing. And Nidoqueen is actually one of the few ways in Gen 4 to punish enemies for making contact. In later generations, you see contact punishment all the time with Rocky Helmet and Iron Barbs and Static and abilities like that, Flame Body, etc. Back in Gen 4 though, there's not that many good Pokemon that have contact punishment. So Nidoqueen was really good for this. Not only to punish fighting types, clicking close combat and other fighting type coverage, but U-turn, because U-turn was commonplace, and U-turn makes contact. So Nidoqueen is one of the few things in the game that can punish U-turn spam. And that's really nice, isn't it? Nidoqueen also matches up well against Lucario, and Nidoqueen also has access to Toxic Spikes itself. So it is doing all this great defensive work, shielding your team from Toxic Spikes, and setting Toxic Spikes itself. Players eventually realize that Nidoqueen is actually kind of amazing on defensive teams, because this is exactly what defensive teams need. Toxic Spikes really help you to make progress against the enemy. You check all these powerful breakers that usually tear apart defensive teams, like fighting types especially, and you punish the U-turn spam, and just poison stuff, and annoy people that are trying to spam physical moves and other such stuff. So Nidoqueen is very effective in the Gen 4 OU metagame, and this is the only time it ever has been effective to this extent in OU. It's kind of crazy. So even though Nidoqueen is not ranked OU officially, it pretty much should be. It is quite common at high level play. It's ranked high on the viability rankings, higher than some actual OU ranked Pokemon. So that's pretty fun, isn't it? Nidoqueen of all things, just having this perfect storm of traits to function well in a competitive OU format, despite being kind of an average Pokemon in all regards when you just look at it at a glance. Now, of all the metagames in history, I think that where you will find the most examples of what I'm talking about here, Pokemon that are good purely because of the meta conditions surrounding them, is Gen 5 OU. Gen 5 OU is one of the most unique metagames in Pokemon history, because this is a metagame where permanent weather effects existed. The weather wars were happening here, and especially permanent rain existing in an OU format had a significant impact on what was viable and what was not. My personal favorite, when it comes to Pokemon only good because of Gen 5's unique meta conditions, is Jellicent. Jellicent, when you look at it, is pretty average, and in every other generation, it is quite average. It has low stats. It does have a good Water Ghost typing, but the stats just suck. The stats are not very good. But in Gen 5, Jellicent is ranked OU, and there's a few reasons for this. The big one, I think, is just its ability Water Absorb, which definitely has a higher stock price in Gen 5 with the ever-presence of rain teams and water-type spam as a strategy, with, Specs Keldeo and Politoed clicking Scald, and various things clicking Scald, to be honest. Water immunity is more valuable than ever in Gen 5, and Jellicent has it. But on top of that, Jellicent is a water immune Pokemon with unique traits compared to other ones. The water ghost typing is really fantastic, and it means Jellicent not only improves your matchup against rain threats, but it can operate as a spin blocker. Spin blocking is important. It means that you can prevent rapid spin from taking place, because rapid spin, being a normal type attack, has no effect on ghost types. This preserves your hazards on the enemy field and keeps your offense moving. So Jellicent is really great actually on sand teams that use spikes for offense, because it improves your matchup against rain, which is one of your worst, more tumultuous matchups, and it allows you to maintain hazards on the field. On top of this, Jellicent is actually pretty well equipped to handle enemy Tyranitar, who would usually be a bad matchup for a ghost type, but because Jellicent has Will-O-Wisp to burn Tyranitar as it comes in, Jellicent can then shrug off the incoming pursuit that is much weaker now, and also result in permanently crippling the enemy Tyranitar. If they're foolish enough to come in on the burn, now your other teammates are not going to be as worried about getting pursuit trapped, and that can be a great game plan. Jellicent also happens to match up outstandingly against Keldeo, and that comes within the package of, positive rain matchup, because Keldeo is commonly seen on rain, but Keldeo is also commonly seen on non-rain teams. It's just that good that you can run it on sand teams or weatherless teams if you want. And Keldeo has not only water-type damage, but fighting-type damage to worry about with its powerful Secret Sword. And guess what? Jellicent is immune to fighting-type moves, being a ghost-type. So it's immune to both of Keldeo's incredibly powerful stab moves, making it one of the best Pokemon in the game at Keldeo counterplay. And that's important in Gen 5. Keldeo is everywhere. Keldeo is meta-defining. All of Jellicent's advantages were at the height of their importance in Gen 5, and of course later in the series, permanent weather didn't exist anymore, so the need to run Water Absorb was not as imperative. Also, spin blocking wasn't as valuable because defog now existed as a hazard removal option. And the power level in general increased, meaning Jellicent's lower stats felt like more of a detriment. The rise of Dark and Ghost as offensive types certainly didn't help Jellicent's case, but Gen 5 OU was a unique time where Jellicent's traits were all working in harmony, and it was actually really good. Speaking of water-immune Pokemon receiving a buff from the general Gen 5 environment, Gastrodon was also ranked OU here, and it was a pretty good alternative to Jellicent on some teams. Gastrodon has the ability Storm Drain, which also grants water immunity. It's different to Water Absorb though. Water Absorb will heal your Pokemon if they're hit by a water move. Storm Drain though will raise your special attack when hit by a water move, which is useful in its own right, but the important part is just immunity to water. And Gastrodon has the excellent Water Ground type combo, which is one of the best type combos in the game. We've seen that, of course, with Swampert in the past, and Gastrodon is much better than Swampert in Gen 5 OU purely because of that water immunity. Gastrodon is not worried about getting scald burned or destroyed by a rain-boosted Hydro Pump or Surf or Waterfall. Gastrodon can just come in cleanly, and because of its great typing, its average stats don't matter so much. That water immunity plus water ground typing means it's neutral to most things in the game, and with HP and defense investment, it can operate as a decent wall against enemies like Garchomp and Dragonite, and sometimes Excadrill. Being ground type, it's also immune to Sandstorm chip damage, which is very nice and makes it a good anti-rain Pokemon on sand teams too. It has recovery, access to Scald, and access to Toxic. If you want a Pokemon similar to Gastrodon that offers the same type profile and water immunity with slightly different traits, maybe you would enjoy Seismitoad. Seismitoad is an alternative to Gastrodon that does have Water Absorb, so it does get healed if struck by water moves. And Seismitoad has some unique options Gastrodon does not. Seismitoad may not have Recover for reliable healing, but it has the crucial Stealth Rock. If your team happens to lack a Stealth Rock setter elsewhere, this can be a convenient way to fill the gap, with improving the rain matchup and having hazard setting on one Pokemon. Seismitoad also has Refresh, which is actually surprisingly useful here. Refresh will cure a Pokemon of burn, poison, or paralysis. Sometimes Gastrodon can get nailed by a Toxic on a switch-in from Politoed or other water-type Pokemon like Tentacruel. Same with Jellicent. These water-absorbed Pokemon can be ruined if they get poisoned. Seismitoad is actually able to play around this counterplay to Rain counterplay. Interestingly, it's an interesting meta-evolution that Seismitoad is used to beat the Toxic that usually beats the water-absorbed guys. Seismitoad has also propped up in other metagames, most notably Gen 8 OU, as the only thing in the world that could handle the Reign of Terror that Dracovish brought to the table. Yes, he's talking about Dracovish again. Sound the alarm. We're mentioning Dracovish again. Seismitoad is the most insane example of a Pokemon being thrust into the meta because it was the only response to an ever-present, unstoppable force. Seismitoad, of course, immune to water and therefore able to switch in against Vicious Rend and take no damage, which was imperative in that metagame. And it was a bit more desirable than other water-absorbed Pokemon in that metagame because of its Stealth Rock, decent type profile, and access to pretty good moves. Nothing else at the time was as good at being a water-immune Pokemon as Seismitoad. So that was interesting too, wasn't it? That was Seismitoad being thrust into meta-relevance for reasons beyond him. Another example of Gen 5 OU pushing an otherwise bad Pokemon historically into the forefront of meta-relevance was Tentacruel. In every other metagame, this guy is kind of average. It's got decent stats, pretty high special defense, good speed, but average overall and just generally not seen competitively. But in Gen 5, this guy was one of the most popular Pokemon on Rain teams because of its access to the ability Rain Dish. Rain Dish will grant you an extra 1/16 of chip heal every single turn while Rain is active. And with this, Tentacruel is almost indestructible with the sheer amount of passive healing it has access to. Also has Rapid Spin for utility, Scald, spam in the rain being very powerful, and because of that, it is one of the most efficient and reliable Rapid Spinners in the format. The healing from both Black Sludge and Rain Dish is so excellent that Tentacruel can be so frustrating and difficult to nail down sometimes in Gen 5. But it was never so good again. It was specifically Gen 5 where Tentacruel was really good. Now finally, I think that I actually could give a mention here to a Pokemon not often talked about in Gen 5 OU, and that is Celebi. Now, you may be surprised to hear me say this because Celebi is meta in previous generations. In Gen 3 OU, it's very good. In fact, in Gen 4 OU, it's waning in popularity a bit, but clinging on to viability still. It's okay. In Gen 5, though, surely you'd think that Celebi is past its prime at this point. It's no longer so powerful inherently to justify using competitively. And the reason it's OU in Gen 5 has nothing to do with its inherent strengths, it's to do with, as usual, its positive matchup against Rain teams. Celebi matches up very well against Rain teams, thanks to its Psychic Grass typing. In particular, it matches up amazingly against Tentacruel. Celebi resists Scald, has Natural Cure, so it's not worried about burn or poison that much, and it has Stab Psychic to threaten Tentacruel directly. On top of this, Celebi has Stealth Rock, so it can set Stealth Rock and threaten one of the most common Rapid Spinners in the game, therefore being very good at maintaining its Stealth Rock on the field. If they try to Rapid Spin, they're going to take a Psychic, so Celebi is a really good Stealth Rock setter if you're up against a Rain team. Celebi also generally matches up well against common Rain Pokemon, like Keldeo. You resist water and fighting. Very convenient, and you threaten them with Psychic, which is a type that hits them super effectively. Celebi can help a little bit against Thundurus T, because of its electric resistance. It's good against Politoed. And Celebi also, interestingly, can use Dry Baton Pass to pivot. Gen 5 is a metagame where they don't allow you to pass stats with Baton Pass, but you can just use it as a pivoting move if you want. And the reason you use it as a pivoting move in Gen 5 is because in Gen 5, if you use U-Turn and the enemy uses Pursuit, they will still hit you as you're switching out. So Pursuit can catch you for using U-Turn. So Celebi does get U-Turn, but it doesn't feel like U-Turn's very good when Tyranitar is everywhere and you're vulnerable to Pursuit. But because you have Dry Baton Pass as another option, you can click Baton Pass, and Baton Pass does completely ignore Pursuit. So you're a rare Psychic type that is not worried about Pursuit Tyranitar. You can escape against Pursuit Tyranitar, which is pretty crucial as well. So all those traits are pretty much the only reason Celebi's any good in Gen 5. It's as a response to other things, and funnily enough, it's a response to things that are also only meta because of meta conditions like Tentacruel, which is quite intriguing, isn't it? Also, if you leave a comment about how I just said baton pass, you're a rotten egg, alright? You don't want to be a rotten egg, not in this day and age. Oh, it's baton pass, it's baton. You're saying it wrong, it's baton pass. Listen, all I know is that I'm Australian, and when I was a child, I did an athletics game of some sort. I can't remember the specifics, but we used batons, and the teacher said, pass the baton to your teammate, pass the baton. Alright, so that's how I learned to say it, and that's how someone said it. An adult with authority said it that way when I was a child, and that's what I learned. And I think you can pronounce it both ways in Australia, maybe, but one of them is valid, okay? I can say baton if I want. I can say it, and they're not gonna get me. No one's gonna get me in trouble. Okay, nothing bad will happen. Anyway, moving on to important topics. The viability of Cofagrigus in Gen 6 RU. This is another Nidoqueen situation. A situation where this guy is ranked RU officially, but in current Gen 6 RU meta, it's well regarded and pretty high on the viability rankings actually. So, by all metrics that matter, this should be RU ranked. Cofagrigus is uniquely good in the Gen 6 metagame for a few reasons. This is a mono ghost type Pokemon with an interesting stat distribution actually. Usually this stat distribution is bad. It has high defense but low everything else, specifically low HP being kind of bad for its bulk. It doesn't have reliable healing, it's usually worse than other bulky ghosts. But in Gen 6 there's kind of a power vacuum for good defensive ghost types, isn't there? There used to be Mega Sableye, but a Mega Sableye got banned in Gen 6. And beyond that, there's like Jellicent, who is decent and sometimes used, but Cofagrigus feels actually like one of the better options here as a defensive ghost type because of its unique qualities. This Pokemon has the ability Mummy, which is a very cool ability in my opinion. If a Pokemon makes contact with Cofagrigus, their ability will be changed to Mummy, effectively overwriting it like a mummy's curse, like a pharaoh's curse. Very cool ability design, I think, with the coffin Pokemon. And this is really useful in a few different ways in Gen 6 RU. This is of course the world where Megas were introduced to the series, and some of the most popular Megas really rely on their abilities. One of them being Mega Lopunny. Mega Lopunny is a fantastic Pokemon that has high speed, high attack, and the ability Scrappy. Scrappy allows Mega Lopunny to hit ghost types with normal and fighting type attacks, which is usually impossible. But if you hit Cofagrigus once with one of these attacks, you will lose that ability Scrappy, and now Mega Lopunny cannot hit Cofagrigus anymore with big damage from its stab moves. That makes Cofagrigus pretty effective against Mega Lopunny. There is also Mega Medicham, who relies heavily on the ability Huge Power, which grants double attack. This is the primary source of Mega Medicham's damage and breaking power. But Cofagrigus switches in, takes one measly hit, and now Mega Medicham's damage output is halved completely. You can also get rid of Aerolate from Pinsir. Mega Pinsir relies on Aerolate to turn its normal moves into flying moves and have their power buffed. Now it's just stuck with crappy old normal moves that can't even hit the coffin, can they? There's also a Zoomeril who rose in popularity in Gen 6 that also relies on huge power for its damage output. And that's all fantastic, isn't it? That's a positive matchup against multiple common Pokemon. Rapid Spin blocking is also still useful in Gen 6. Even though some Pokemon get Defog now, a new option to remove hazards, a lot of teams rely on Excadrill for hazard removal because it's just so good. Excadrill is really common in Gen 6 RU, and it's a great Rapid Spinner. Cofagrigus happens to block Rapid Spin from Excadrill, match up pretty well against it with its higher defense, and threaten to Will-O-Wisp Excadrill, crippling it significantly. Cofagrigus also has access to Toxic Spikes, randomly. I guess it's like a trap in the pyramid to prevent grave robbers or something. They got poison spikes in there. I don't know, there's flavor reasons for Toxic Spikes on the coffin, there is. And it's a great option as a entry hazard. It's something to do on a defensive switch that makes a little bit of progress to annoy the enemy. Sometimes it can be really useful. Pain Split is your best form of healing. Not a great form of healing, but because you have low base HP, Pain Split ends up being pretty good actually sometimes, and working well enough. So Cofagrigus is uniquely good in the Gen 6 metagame, responding very well to multiple popular physical offensive Pokemon, and also being a good spin blocker against the most popular rapid spinner and most popular hazard remover, Excadrill. And the most recent example of an otherwise bad Pokemon rising up to OU status because of meta trends around it is Galarian Weezing. This Pokemon existed in Gen 8, where it debuted, but in that generation it wasn't very good. So why is it OU in Gen 9, and why did it only rise to OU very recent? Weezing Galar is actually one of the most interesting regional forms we've ever seen, because it has the incredible and unique ability Neutralizing Gas. Neutralizing Gas is an ability that, while active, all other abilities have no effect. It is counterplay to enemy abilities, and this has some really interesting applications. And what makes Galarian Weezing so useful with this ability in Gen 9 in particular is that this ability disables Goldengo's ability. Goldengo's ability, Good as Gold, is one of the strongest abilities Pokemon has ever seen, granting complete immunity to status moves, including almost every move that isn't an attack, basically. You can't use Trick against Goldengo, and crucially, you can't use Defog against Goldengo. Goldengo is able to block Rapid Spin and Defog at the same time and keep hazards up very reliably. Galarian Weezing is one of the few Pokemon in the game that is able to actually just defog and remove hazards in the face of Goldengo, and that is very hard to come by. Not only because defog is less common in Gen 9, it's been cut from a lot of movesets, but most Pokemon just thud in the face of Goldengo when trying to use it. So that's massive. Galarian Weezing can also Will-O-Wisp Goldengo, another good way to punish it. And on top of this incredibly useful trait of actually reliably removing hazards in a world where that's very hard to do, Galarian Weezing has other good defensive application. Galarian Weezing is crucially very good against two common Pokemon in the format, Zamazenta and Iron Valiant. Galarian Weezing has a ×4 resistance to fighting and a very good defense stat, meaning it is extremely effective against Zamazenta, who is a very popular Pokemon in the format. And you have great tools to punish Zamazenta, like Will-O-Wisp, Strange Steam for Fairy Stab, or even just Sludge Bomb to just hit the guy. Iron Valiant is also very common, and you crucially resist Fairy and Fighting, and shrug off most of its other coverage moves that it has, on top of directly threatening it with Poison or Fairy Stab, both of which hit Iron Valiant super effectively. And that's almost good enough, right? That's pretty much enough to justify Gen 9 OU usage. You can defog against Goldengo, and you're good against Iron Valiant and Zamazenta. But you're also good against some fringe stuff, like Low Kicks. Low Kicks is actually reasonably popular in Gen 9 OU because of its ability Tinted Lens, which grants double damage against resisted opponents. Tinted Lens kind of makes damage neutral against everything, but Galarian Weezing disables that ability. It cuts it from existence. So, Low Kicks just deals normal damage, and Galarian Weezing resists all of that regular damage, making it a pretty effective wall against what is otherwise a frightening wall breaker. Neutralizing Gas has other application too. You can't just disrupt Goldengo, you can disrupt Garganical, who also relies heavily on its ability for status immunity. So you can Will-O-Wisp Garganical, that's nice. You can Will-O-Wisp Hatterene too. Magic Bounce will have no effect. And Galarian Weezing can also disable important defensive abilities from enemies, like Gliscor's Poison Heal. If you disable Gliscor's Poison Heal, instead of getting healed by their Toxic Orb like they usually do, they will start taking damage, as most other Pokemon do when they're poisoned, because its damn ability isn't working. That can be really useful. It's kind of hard to pull off because you are weak to ground, which Gliscor is a ground type, but sometimes you can bring Galarian Weezing in on Gliscor and punish them significantly. Galarian Weezing also helps against Ogerpon Wellspring. It's not completely solid against it, you're still going to take a lot from Ivy Cudgel, but you resist Grass, which is nice, and you threaten them with Sludge Bomb, plus you have high defense. So Galarian Weezing helps a little bit in that matchup, which is an important matchup to cover. And I mean, these are just the well-known common ways to take advantage of Neutralizing Gas, but Galarian Weezing can take advantage of this ability in most games. It's usually useful to disable abilities, and there are unique ways that this can come up that you probably wouldn't think of. It's just generally really nice. So Galarian Weezing rising in OU, I think, is a pretty awesome trend that is a great response to a lot of problems that have propped up in the OU metagame. It's hard to remove hazards, it's hard to handle Iron Valiant, it's hard to handle all these Pokemon, and these stupid abilities that ignore status are getting on everyone's nerves. Galarian Weezing has risen up to solve all of these problems itself, and it's doing a good job. One of my favorite things in competitive Pokemon is when a niche is found for some random guy because they have such specific traits that just help in some certain situation that justify their usage. But it's arguably even cooler when that niche trait is so valuable that it propels that Pokemon to actual meta relevance and high usage. A Pokemon that on the surface seems bad, but has enough useful niche traits to justify using on competitive teams so much that it becomes a part of the metagame, whether it wanted to or not. These Pokemon rising up, I think, is such fun, because it's never expected. No one expected Galarian Weezing to become OU. This is competitive Pokemon taking on a life of its own a little bit, and evolving on its own, which I love to see. What is your favorite example of a Pokemon that is meta because of specific circumstances in a format rather than inherent strength? Let me know down below in the comments, and thank you for watching.